The summer heat bore down on the sleepy town of Westvale, a place where even the most tumultuous lives had a surface stillness, as if hiding secrets beneath calm waters. Such was the case for Martha Hughes, a high school teacher of literature, and Daniel Cortez, an ex-convict with a past that he wished more than anything to leave behind. Martha's life was filled with routines. Early morning coffee, lectures about symbolism in The Great Gatsby, and quiet evenings grading papers. But there was a restlessness growing within her, a sense that she was wasting away in a life of monotony. Daniel, on the other hand, had recently been released from prison after serving 5 years for armed robbery, a crime he had committed under duress, with a gang that had long since betrayed him. He had vowed never to return to his old ways, even if it meant a life on the run. They met by chance one muggy afternoon at a gas station outside town. Martha had been driving home from her summer course at the local community college, while Daniel was just trying to get a ride out of Westvale. She noticed him standing by the roadside, his face weary but hopeful. Something in his eyes, a silent desperation that mirrored her own, made her stop. "Need a ride?" she asked, surprising herself as much as him. He nodded, grateful and wary. "Yeah, thanks." Martha didn't ask questions. She knew what people saw when they looked at Daniel. The hardened expression, the tired eyes, the kind of face you'd avoid in a dark alley. But as they drove, something shifted between them. His politeness, the careful way he spoke, and the haunted look that slipped out when he thought she wasn't looking. It all made her realize there was more to him than the label of ex-con. Their journey might have ended there, with an awkward goodbye and a fleeting memory of a kind stranger. But when Martha stopped at a diner just outside of town, 2 men approached their booth. They were too well-dressed for a diner like this, their gazes too intense. Daniel's face hardened. He recognized them immediately, men from his old gang. They hadn't come for the food. Cortez, the taller one, sneered, slipping into the seat across from them. "You didn't think you could just walk away, did you?" Martha could see the tension in Daniel's shoulders, the way his hand edged closer to hers under the table, as if seeking support. The men spoke in cold threats, talking about debts unpaid and promises broken. Martha didn't understand everything, but she knew enough. They wanted Daniel back, or they wanted him dead. In that moment, an unspoken decision passed between Martha and Daniel. She wasn't about to leave him to whatever fate these men had planned. She didn't understand why she was suddenly ready to put her own life in danger for a man she barely knew. Maybe it was her need to break free from her own invisible shackles, or maybe it was just the right thing to do. Without a word, Martha kicked Daniel's foot, signaling the back door of the diner. He got the message. She stood abruptly, knocking her coffee cup onto the table, its contents splashing over the mafia thug's expensive suit. He cursed, giving them just the distraction they needed. They bolted. Outside, they sprinted to Martha's car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. The men were right behind them. Daniel, seeing Martha's panic, yanked the keys from her, swiftly started the car, and they roared away just as the thugs burst out of the diner, guns drawn. "Where do we go?" Martha yelled, her heart pounding louder than the engine. "Somewhere far," Daniel replied, his voice steady, though his eyes were wild with fear. "I know a place, but they won't stop, Martha. Not until they get what they want." "And what do they want?" she asked. "Me. Or the money I stole from them." It turned out Daniel hadn't just been any member of the gang. He'd been the one who dared to betray them, taking a large sum of money that they were laundering. The money was long gone, split among friends who had disappeared from his life when he was caught. Now they were after him with a vengeance. Martha made a decision that changed everything. She would help him, not just drive him to safety, but really help him face them, escape from them, and take back control of his life. And in doing so, maybe she would take control of her own. They drove through the night, heading deeper into the countryside, to a safe house Daniel knew. An old cabin that had belonged to a friend of his mother's, a place where no one would think to look. It wasn't much, but it was something. Over the next few days, they prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Martha, once a woman of books and lectures, found herself learning to shoot an old rifle Daniel found in the cabin's attic. Daniel taught her how to stay calm under pressure, how to face fear head-on. Skills he had learned in prison and on the streets long before that. They knew they couldn't run forever. The mafia had resources, connections. They'd find them eventually. So they made a plan, a trap to end it all. Using what little money they had, they spread false rumors through old contacts. Whispers that Daniel was alone, scared, ready to negotiate. The men came just as they knew they would. That final night, the cabin was quiet, save for the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Martha waited in the shadows, the rifle steady in her hands, her eyes fixed on the approaching figures. Daniel stood in the open, his hands raised as if in surrender. The men approached, sneering, guns aimed. They never saw Martha. She fired, a single shot that shattered the silence, hitting the ground just in front of them, a warning. In the confusion that followed, Daniel lunged, disarming the nearest thug, and chaos erupted. It wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. But in the end, it was over. The men were bound, disarmed, and left for the authorities. Daniel and Martha knew they couldn't stay. They had crossed a line that neither law nor crime would forget. As dawn broke, they left the cabin, a new plan forming. They would head west, maybe change their names, start fresh. Together, they had faced down the mafia, and together, they would keep running, keep fighting for the lives they both deserved. And for the first time in a long time, Martha felt alive. The sun rose on a different Westvale, one where an ordinary high school teacher had taken a stand against danger she never thought she would face. Martha Hughes drove westward, her hands tightly gripping the steering wheel, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead of her and Daniel. There was a silence between them, an understanding that everything they had done had changed who they were and how they would live from now on. As they passed fields and forests, they tried to focus on what lay ahead. Daniel leaned back, watching the world blur by, his thoughts bouncing between the past and the uncertain future. He knew that the mafia's reach extended far and wide. It wasn't just about staying hidden, it was about truly vanishing. "We need to change everything," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper above the hum of the engine. Martha nodded, her eyes fixed on the road. Names, looks, even habits. She paused, a flicker of fear crossing her eyes. "But where do we go? I've never left Westvale for anything other than a vacation." Daniel looked at her, the fragility of her life's routine stark against the chaos of his own past. "Mexico," he said, an idea slowly taking shape. "I know people there. People who can help us start over." Martha shot him a skeptical look. "Mexico? You think we can make it that far without getting caught? They won't expect us to cross a border. They'll be looking for us nearby, assuming we're hiding like scared animals." He gave her a grim smile. "If we keep moving, avoid the obvious routes, we can make it. I know the way." There was a pause. Then Martha nodded again, more decisively this time. "Okay, Mexico." Then they stopped in a small town a few hours later, a place that seemed almost forgotten by time. Wooden storefronts lined the single road, and an old diner with a faded neon sign welcomed weary travelers. Martha parked the car behind an abandoned barn, obscuring it from any wandering eyes. They both knew it was time to transform themselves. Inside the diner's bathroom, Martha took a deep breath before cutting her hair. She watched as the locks fell into the sink, her reflection becoming a stranger. Daniel, waiting outside, used a razor he bought from the convenience store to shave his scruffy beard, revealing a different man, a man who could disappear into the crowd. Later, they bought cheap clothes from a thrift store. Martha traded her teacher cardigans for simple jeans and a flannel shirt. Daniel chose a plain t-shirt and an old, worn cap to hide his face. They looked like travelers, like people who had been on the road far too long and had seen far too much. As night fell, they left the small town behind, traveling under the cover of darkness. Daniel kept his eyes sharp on the road, every passing car a potential threat, every flashing light an omen. They avoided the main highways, choosing instead the old state roads that wound through sleepy towns and dense woods. Each time they stopped for gas, Daniel kept a lookout while Martha quickly paid, their interactions with others brief and guarded. It was in these dark hours, with the hum of the road beneath them and the world asleep around them, that they began to talk. Not about escape plans or the mafia, but about themselves. Martha told him about her life as a teacher, how she had always wanted to do something bigger but never knew what that could be. Daniel listened, his eyes softening, and told her about his sister, the one person who had ever believed in him, who had begged him to leave the gang before it was too late. "Did you ever see her again?" Martha asked, her voice quiet. "No," Daniel replied, looking out the window at the passing night. "She died in a car crash while I was inside. I couldn't even go to her funeral." Martha reached across the console, her fingers brushing his arm. It was the first time she had touched him without fear or urgency, just a simple human connection. He looked at her, and for a moment, the shadows of the past seemed to fade. As they got closer to the border, they knew they needed a plan. They couldn't simply drive across and hope for the best. Daniel remembered a contact, an old friend of his sister's, who had connections to people in the underground network that helped people disappear. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. They met the contact, Javier, in a seedy motel on the edge of a border town. Javier was wary at first, his eyes darting between them, assessing whether this was worth the risk. Martha had never felt more out of place, standing in the dingy room with peeling wallpaper, but she stood her ground, her eyes meeting Javier's with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. Daniel made their case, his voice calm but with an edge of desperation. "We just need safe passage. We have money." "Not much, but enough." Javier leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "The mafia doesn't forget, you know. If I help you, they'll come looking for me too." Daniel nodded. "I know, but we're not asking you to go with us. Just help us get across the border. After that, we'll disappear." Javier was silent for a long time. Then he sighed. "There's a place. An old crossing that's not watched much anymore. It'll be dangerous, but if you're serious about vanishing, it's your best shot." Martha and Daniel exchanged a look, then both nodded. The crossing was everything Javier had warned them about. Remote, treacherous, and crawling with unseen dangers. They left the car behind, walking through dense brush and rocky terrain under the cover of darkness. The moon was their only light, casting long shadows over the desert landscape. At one point, they heard the sound of vehicles in the distance. Engines rumbling, voices shouting in Spanish. Daniel pulled Martha down behind a cluster of rocks, his hand gripping hers tightly. They stayed there, not daring to breathe, until the sounds faded into the night. As dawn approached, they finally saw it. The faint outline of Mexico on the horizon, the promise of freedom just beyond reach. Martha felt her heart swell, a mixture of hope and fear washing over her. They had come so far, but they weren't safe yet. Daniel looked at her, his face tired but determined. "We're almost there, Martha. Just a little further." She nodded, her hand still in his. Together, they rose and continued on, step by step, towards a new beginning. By the time they reached the other side, the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. They stood there for a moment, looking back at the land they had left behind. Everything they had known, everything that had tried to break them. Martha turned to Daniel, a smile breaking across her face for the first time in what felt like years. "We made it," she whispered. He smiled back, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before. Peace. "Yeah, we did." They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. They were still running, still hiding from a past that could catch up with them at any moment. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. With the sun rising behind them, they walked together towards their future, ready to face whatever came next. The scorching sun beat down on them as they trudged through the desert. The promise of safety in Mexico had become real, but the dangers were still very much alive. Despite the exhaustion that tugged at their every step, Martha and Daniel pressed on. They could feel it in their bones. This was the final stretch, the place where everything would either fall apart or come together. Days passed in a haze of moving from town to town, always under the radar, meeting with contacts who were more shadow than substance. Finally, They found themselves in a small, bustling village deep in the Mexican countryside. Javier's contact, a wiry, mysterious man named Rafael, had promised a final solution. A new identity, a new life far away where the mafia's influence wouldn't reach. The meeting was set at a cantina on the village outskirts, a place worn by years of desert winds and travelers' secrets. The cantina was loud, filled with laughter and the sounds of a mariachi band. But Daniel and Martha kept to themselves in a dimly lit corner, waiting. Raphael arrived exactly when he said he would, calm, unassuming, and carrying an air of danger. "I hear you've traveled a long way for freedom," Raphael said, his voice barely audible above the music. He gave Daniel and Martha a careful look. "I can offer you that, but you must understand, there is no going back. You will be ghosts." Martha nodded, the weight of his words heavy on her shoulders. "We understand," she said, her voice unwavering. Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand in his. They were in this together, no matter what. Raphael slid 2 manila envelopes across the table. Inside were their new identities, names that felt foreign on their tongues but would soon become who they were. Daniel was now Carlos Herrera, a mechanic from a small town in southern Mexico. Martha was Ana Herrera, his wife, a teacher who had left her old life behind. Everything was in place, right down to the forged documents and the address of a house in a distant village where no one would ask questions. It was supposed to be the end, the beginning of something new. But fate had other plans. As they left the cantina, the night air cool against their faces, Martha noticed something that made her blood run cold. A shadow moving just out of sight, too careful, too deliberate. She squeezed Daniel's hand. "We're being followed," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel's eyes darted around, and in an instant, he knew she was right. The mafia had found them. They had crossed the border, followed their trail, and now they were here, ready to finish what they had started. "Run," Daniel hissed, pushing Martha forward. "Get to the car." But it was too late. Shots rang out, echoing through the empty streets. People screamed, running for cover as chaos erupted. Martha felt Daniel's grip tighten on her hand, pulling her along as they sprinted towards the alley. She could hear the pounding of footsteps behind them, the shouts in Spanish, the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. They dove behind a stack of crates, Daniel shielding Martha with his body as bullets splintered the wood around them. "We can't outrun them," he said, his voice grim but steady. "We have to fight." Martha looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined this. Never imagined that she would be here, in the middle of a dusty Mexican village, fighting for her life. But as she looked into Daniel's eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen before. A fierce, unyielding determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for her, for their chance at a new life. "Okay," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Let's do this." Daniel grabbed a metal pipe from the ground, and Martha picked up a broken bottle, their makeshift weapons a far cry from the guns their pursuers carried. But they had the element of surprise, and they had nothing left to lose. As the footsteps drew closer, Daniel moved first, swinging the pipe with all his strength. Connected with a sickening crack, and the man went down. Martha lunged forward, slashing with the bottle, her fear giving way to adrenaline. She caught a second man across the arm, his gun clattering to the ground. "Run!" Daniel shouted again, and this time they moved together, their feet pounding against the cobblestones as they raced through the narrow streets. They could hear the shouts behind them, the confusion as the remaining men regrouped, but they didn't look back. They reached the edge of the village, the desert stretching out before them like an endless sea. Martha's lungs burned. Her legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but she kept moving, Daniel's hand in hers, pulling her forward. And then, just as they thought they might make it, a car roared up in front of them, cutting off their escape. The door opened, and a man stepped out, a face Daniel recognized all too well. Marco, the mafia lieutenant who had once been his friend, now his executioner. "There's nowhere left to run, Cortez," Marco said, his voice cold and mocking. He raised his gun, aiming it at Daniel's chest. Martha stepped in front of Daniel, her eyes blazing. "If you want him, you'll have to kill me first." Marco laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "So be it." The world seemed to slow down as Marco's finger tightened on the trigger. But before he could fire, a shot rang out, sharp and deafening in the still night. Marco staggered, his eyes wide with shock as he fell to the ground. Behind him stood Raphael, a smoking pistol in his hand. "Go," he said, his voice urgent. "There's a car waiting at the edge of the village. Take it and don't look back." Martha and Daniel didn't hesitate. They ran to the car, their hearts pounding as they climbed inside. Daniel started the engine, the tires spinning in the dirt as they sped away, the village lights fading into the distance behind them. They drove until the sun rose, the desert stretching out endlessly around them. Finally, they stopped, the adrenaline fading, leaving only exhaustion in its place. Daniel looked over at Martha, her face streaked with dirt and tears, and he reached out, taking her hand. "We made it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Martha nodded, a smile breaking through the exhaustion. "We did." They were free. The mafia was behind them, and ahead lay a new life, one that they would build together, no matter how difficult. They had faced death, faced their pasts, and come out the other side. As the sun rose over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Daniel and Martha knew that this was the beginning of something new. They were no longer a teacher and an ex-convict, no longer running from the shadows of their pasts. They were survivors, and they were ready to live.